I always thought that Albert Einstein's scientific contributions were the most important thing about him. But this week I discovered there's a lot more to Einstein regarding spiritual thought than I had realized before. So to explain more fully, I'd like to take you back a little bit. In childhood, I was always aware and always drawn to this sense of magic and wonder. Things like telescopes, gazing at the stars, just wondering about the universe. Those things made me feel safe and a sense of awe and wonder and at peace. I also read a lot in grade school and I fell in love with science. My love of science and my love of this magic, wonder, and imagination and awe had an opportunity to kind of blend together in the 8th grade. That year, I had a school project where I was to write a paper for both history and English. And I was 13 years old, just about to turn 14. That year was also 1979 was the 100-year anniversary of Einstein's birthday, and Einstein was everywhere. Documentaries on Einstein, special, memorial stamps, in pop culture, Einstein, and I totally absorbed myself in Einstein in this 8th grade paper. And in those days, there were no PCs. There were no word processors. Well, there were some, but they were very, very hard to get a hold of. So my sister typed the paper for me using a manual typewriter and correction tape. Does that bring back good memories for some of you? Probably bad memories, especially that correction tape. So in this total delving myself into this paper, I was really obsessed with Einstein, and I found it easy to connect with him, not because of his theories, well, partially because of that, but also he wasn't an egomaniac. He was likable. And I think the world feels that way. He was kind of the absent-minded professor. Not sure if you know this, but he couldn't drive a car. He said it was too complicated. He often forgot where he lived, and so he took strolls home after work, and in his walking, he often lost his way and forgot where he lived. So he had to keep his address in his suit pocket so he wouldn't totally get lost. He couldn't swim, so he's a kindred spirit of mine. And I was embarrassed about that my whole childhood. I was so humiliated. I thought it was just this, it made me so anxious thinking about telling someone that I couldn't swim. And to have this superstar also not a swimmer and not perfect gave me a sense of relatedness to him. And by the way, I read that, Einstein was absent-minded and forgetful. And being absent-minded and forgetful, the good news, I hear that's a sign of potential genius. And that being absent-minded and forgetful helps you remember at times, for many people, the things that are most important. So they said he had this quality of forgetting the things that weren't important so he could remember these miles-long scientific formulas and all these calculations in his head. But compounding this forgetfulness, Einstein was also a daydreamer. He would daydream during class, and his headmaster at school, equivalent to a principal, told his father that Einstein would never make a success of anything in his life. So I guess he had the last word. Einstein had the last word in that. So back to the paper. I actually found it a few years ago. So here it is. It's a 21-page type paper, and you can see the fading yellow pages, but also I have 15 pages of index material and diagrams and more more diagrams and more diagrams about how nuclear fission works, and it goes on and on and on. I just absorb myself in it, and I convinced my history teacher and my English teacher to both accept it since it was so long, and they agreed as long as they could get independent verification and review from the science teacher at the junior high. So 3 teachers reviewed it. And this was the first huge project of my life where I really took the reins. And it would be the longest paper that I would ever write in my life, because luckily, as I went on in the years, and at UCLA, they never wanted a paper longer than 5 pages because they had so many people in a class. So that was the longest paper that I would write. And the biggest scientific takeaway for me about Einstein was what he discovered about time, space, matter, and light. The one takeaway that I think is the most important scientifically is that light is the only constant. Everything else bends and fluxes so light can stay constant. Time bends, matter bends, space and gravity warp, objects change shape and mass. Especially when they approach the speed of light, they become unrecognizable. All that's so light can remain the universal constant. The speed of light is the same for every observer. And it's without going into the details, it's just fascinating. And to me, it's kind of spiritual that light is the constant, because to me, light represents God. And light is this thing that is part particle and part wave that dances back and forth between these two worlds of particle and wave. To me, light represents God. Light is God. And I think Einstein's theories really point to that, although he did not say that specifically. But what he did say was, he said, concerning matter, we have all been wrong. What we have called matter is energy, whose vibration has been so lowered as to be perceptible to our senses. Matter is spirit reduced to the point of visibility. And essentially, there is no matter. It's all energy, right? So I was so fascinated by all this, and I'm going to talk about the spiritual implications of this thinking. But I was diving into his theories. I was breaking down E equals mc squared and the Lorentz equations, and just doing all these massive calculations just to prove out, to myself if his calculations really worked and things like that. And over the years, I still continued to seek that magic out. The Einstein paper was the reason why I became a physics major in college. But that was a mistake. My first year in physics class, my freshman year, I realized that studying physics is not magic. It was so painful. It was so boring. And the exciting part of physics comes like much further, like in PhD realm. And I just couldn't go on further. But I realized that my truth path to magic had already begun to happen in a different way when I was 16. And someone handed me a copy of Yogananda Paramahansa's book, Autobiography of a Yogi, and Richard Bach's Illusions. I became a spiritual seeker. And then when they told me to visit a Buddhist church and write a paper, I became even more of a spiritual seeker. And that's where the magic is today for me. So this week, my journey brought me full circle back to Einstein when I found some notes about things that were nowhere in this paper. So I'm going to share a few quotes throughout the rest of my talk from Einstein. And they are so moving and important to me. First of all, Einstein said that all religions, arts, and sciences are branches of the same tree. All religions, arts, and sciences are branches of the same tree. If I can recall the Hindu god Sarasvati, she's the goddess of knowledge, but she's also the goddess of music, right? So there's this, and Apollo as well. So there's this blending of arts and sciences into one. And I loved it that Einstein drew this consistency for me where I don't want a life where my spirituality is on one side and logic is on the other. I love unity because it helps me unite into one view that my logic and science supports my spirituality and my spirituality is supported by logic and science. It's one. It's not, because otherwise, you feel crazy. So around the time of the writing of this paper, Fritjof Capra wrote a book called The Tao of Physics, and I visited him in San Francisco. And also the same year, Gary Zukav wrote The Dancing Woolly Masters. And both of those books were essentially, the message was this: science and spirituality are converging. And everything that the quantum physicists started to discover, they realized was also echoed in the ancient teachings of the Vedas of Hinduism and the Sutras of Buddhism and other ancient texts. They were right all along. And that was so fascinating that I remember reading about lots of scientists began converting away from mainstream religions to follow either Eastern mysticism or New Thought. And I think that was the precursor for unity. And that was a precursor for movies like What the Bleep, for instance. And you realize that all of the profound questions in life have spiritual answers, even if they're scientific questions. When you talk about the very big or the very small or the beginning of time or the end of time, the quantum physicists and the cosmologists and the astronomers end up bumping into spiritual questions. And many of them become spiritual, having been atheists before that, because of those questions. So the wonder of Einstein's theories sparked my imagination when I was 13 years old. But the quotes that I'm about to read, I didn't discover until very recently. A lot of these until this week. Einstein talked a lot about wonder and imagination, so I want to share this one. And he writes it from a standpoint of he, so I apologize for the gender polarity. Einstein said, "He who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe is as good as dead. His eyes are closed." I'll say that again. He who can no longer pause to wonder and stand in rapt awe is as good as dead. His eyes are closed. Do you agree? Isn't it important to you that you have awe and wonder about the world around you? I remember when we were meeting in person, we used to have a practice each week that predated my days of ministry, where we would share our moments of awe. And for some reason, it always makes me think of Chris, because she always had some good moments of awe to share. Awe, Chris. And the moment of awe in my life that drew me to be a spiritual seeker was there all along. It was just in these existential questions. When I was in grade school, I used to ask my dad, I was so in awe of the universe, I used to ask him these difficult questions. And like, Dad, why does anything exist at all? Dad, where does God come from? And he couldn't answer the questions, but I loved the questions still. And I grew up a Catholic, and over the years, my questions led me out of Catholicism, and they led me to a new way of thinking, which is, matured into unity. And it took imagination to overcome a lot of what I was taught about being cast into hell, being punished, and God being judgmental, and the existence of hell. It took a lot of imagination for me to develop a new world paradigm. Einstein said a lot about imagination, and one of the things he said was, imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited, but imagination encircles the world. I love that. He goes further and he says, imagination is everything. It is the preview of life's coming attractions. Isn't that great? Imagination is everything. It's the preview of life's coming attractions. What does he mean by that? I think I know. I think what he meant was that we create and discover with our imaginations. And it goes to the third principle of unity and the third principle of religious science. We are co-creators. We use imagination when we vision. We use imagination when we affirm. We use imagination when we pray, don't we? We see the person whole and complete in our imagination. And if you remember, this is a coincidence. When I wrote the Einstein paper that year, someone else wrote a book. Shakti Gwain, if that rings a bell, wrote Creative Visualization, which was all about the power of imagination. So I think there was kind of a gestalt happening in the world at that time of the power of imagination. Another Einstein quote. Here is where he shifts to more spiritual thinking. Everything is energy. That's all there is to it. Match the frequency of the reality you want, and you can't help but get that reality. When something vibrates, the electrons of the entire universe resonate with it because everything is connected. I'm going to say the first part of this again. Match the frequency of the reality you want, and you can't help but get that reality. Who does that sound like? That sounds like Esther Hicks to me. It sounds like getting into the vortex to me. It sounds like the law of attraction, which has its roots in the Bible and was carried on by New Thought thinkers and is very, very much relevant and alive today. So Einstein was, I think, ahead of his time there. He also spoke about mystical forms of gathering wisdom. And I'll share two quotes. First of all, he said, I think 99 times and I find nothing. I stop thinking, swim in silence, and the truth comes to me. I'll say that again. I think 99 times and I find nothing. I stop thinking, swim in silence, and the truth comes to me. Now, I don't know if the word meditation even existed or was known to Einstein at the time, but I think he would have said meditation. And that's what this is. It's the truth today. He also says, I did not arrive at my understanding of the fundamental laws of the universe through my rational mind. I believe he was using his mystical mind. I believe he was getting a mystical download. And finally, he said, look deep into nature, and then you will understand everything. Look deep into nature, and then you will understand everything. So he definitely had this mystical side of him in his quotes that are not the first things that you read about Einstein, but they are emerging today. They're starting to emerge today. So instead of people talking about E equals MC squared and atomic energy, they're talking about this spirituality of Einstein. So finally, Einstein had a lot to say about community and the unity of the human race, as well as compassion. One of the more interesting quotes from him is, although I am a typical loner in daily life, my consciousness of belonging to the invisible community of those who strive for truth, beauty, and justice has preserved me from feeling isolated. So although he is a loner, he does not feel alone when he knows that there's a community of like-minded souls. And on kindness, Einstein says, I speak to everyone in the same way, whether he's the garbage man or the president of a university. This is Namaste consciousness. It's empathy and compassion. It's what we believe. And it's really wonderful. It makes me wish I would have It makes me wish he was still alive so I can meet him. And finally, he goes on to say this about oneness. Our separation from each other is an optical illusion of consciousness. That is an important quote. Our separation from each other is an optical illusion of consciousness. The greatest tragedy of human existence is the illusion of this separateness. And our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures. Gosh. So that's the last quote I'm going to share from Einstein. And forgive me I thought it was very important to actually say all these quotes because there are actually probably 30 more that are right in this line, but I think these are the ones that spoke loudest to me. I'm convinced that if Einstein were alive today, he would be a mystic, giving huge talks and podcasts and workshops, and he'd be on Super Soul Sunday with Oprah and the Brene Brown podcast and hanging out with Eckhart Tolle, and he would be a spiritual guru. I'm convinced of that. I think he was headed in that way. There's so much to be said additionally about Einstein's own religious views, which changed through his lifetime. And people tried to nail him down in terms of what he believed and what he did not believe. But I decided today to let the quotes stand as a proof and reflection of what he was about. So if I can sum up Einstein's wisdom in a few phrases, it would be this. God is in everything, manifesting as pure energy. When we vibrate at the level of what we want to attract, it must come to us because everything is connected. And we are all connected in God. We are all one. So be kind, be passionate, be compassionate. And remember to stop and be in the silence and in nature. And finally, never ever forget that you are not alone in this community of like-minded souls. And so it is.